So if you read over this chapter, and hopefully you have for the homework, a lot of this should seem a bit familiar, like deja vu almost, right?
A little too much detail.
Just a bit more detailed than before. Okay. So we are going to be talking about the different types of ways X-rays do interact with matter, and particularly the human body. Right? So exactly what is going on inside the body when the X-rays do reach the patient. All right. So first of all, we have some definitions to get through. So primary radiation, what is that? What is primary radiation?
It's the radiation that exits the tube, the collimator before it gets to the patient.
Okay, the X-rays that exit the tube and the collimator before they reach the patient. So what exactly happens, or what exactly do those X-rays pass through? Right, so you have your filament, right? With your filament, you have your thermionic emission, right? You turn on your voltage, electrons shoot across, they hit the anode, you have your Bremsstrahlung, you have your characteristic, it creates X-rays, and from there, those X-rays at the target of the anode in your tube, what happens to them? Where do they go?
They go down to the port.
All right, so some of them will go down towards the port. Are they all going to go down towards the port?
No.
No, right? Where else can they go?
Yeah.
All over the place.
All over the place. Right, so just because, right, so a lot of the diagrams you'll see, right, you always just see electrons and then X-rays. But keep in mind the X-rays are being created in all directions, right? The only reason why the X-rays are exiting out of the port is because we have that thing over there, right? What is that sitting on the table? Does anyone remember? I mean, that's not the tube. The tube would sit inside that thing.
Oh, I mean the housing.
That is the housing, the protective housing, right? So if you think back to last semester, right? Protective housing is what keeps the X-rays going in all of the wrong directions from exiting, right? That way you only have your beam coming out of the window and the port. So X-rays that are heading down towards the port, what do they pass through first?
Filtration.
Exit the tube.
So they're created at the anode, they're heading down towards the port. What are they going to pass through?
The window.
Good, they're going to pass through the window. Where is the window located?
At the bottom of the housing.
At the bottom of the glass X-ray tube. Right, remember the window is that
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
thin part of the X-ray tube right underneath your target, right underneath the anode. So X-rays pass through that window. Some of them are going to be absorbed, right? What type of X-rays in particular end up being absorbed by that window? Okay, yes, the weak ones, the low energy ones. Okay, so that is part of your inherent filtration. Okay, what does it mean what does inherent filtration mean again?
Built in.
Built in, right? It is just part of the whole apparatus. In this case, it's filtration that's just inherent. It's just part of the X-ray tube because you're going to have that glass no matter what. So the glass window absorbs some of those X-rays, okay? And then they keep traveling down. And then what do they pass through? Okay, so they get to the collimator. Right between the protective housing and the collimator, what does it pass through? Okay, it passes through some filters. What are those filters made of?
Aluminum.
Aluminum. Great. So you have a thin sheet of aluminum, and that is going to be your added filtration. Okay, and so once it passes through that aluminum, okay, passes through your collimator, exits the tube and the collimator and the whole housing, now you have your primary radiation beam. Okay, very good. So, inside the tube, right, we do have a voltage. That is what we use to accelerate those electrons from the cathode to the anode. Okay. So, voltage, unit of voltage is
Maybe
okay, well, what's the basic unit of voltage?
EV.
Volts,
volts.
right?
Yeah.
Don't overthink it. Right, so voltage is measured in volts. Thing is, in X-ray, we're using really high voltages, so we do use kV, kilovolts. Okay. However, photon energy is not measured in volts. What is it measured in instead? EV. What is EV? Electron volts. Very good. Okay, once again, because we are using kilovolts to accelerate our electrons also have really high energies, so we're dealing with kilo electron volts. Okay. And then, so what determines the highest energy of our photon? kVp, right, a kilovoltage peak, or peak kilovoltage, either order works. Okay. So what is the kVp exactly?
The highest energy in the beam.
Highest energy in what beam?
Primary.
In the primary beam?
KVP is the highest, is the peak of the voltage applied to the tube.
Okay, so you are actually both correct, right? Because your kVp is the highest voltage across the tube, right? Your voltage across the tube from your cathode to anode is not constant, right? It does rise and it does fall. But when it rises, the very highest level it rises to is that kilovolt peak. At that point, the electrons you're sending across have the highest energy possible. When they reach the anode and they create photons, those photons, their highest energy will be equal to the highest energy of those electrons. So also the kVp level, right? So the kVp is the voltage across the cathode to anode. It also determines the highest energy of those electrons. It also determines the highest energy of your photons. Okay. Now I know this isn't directly related to radiation protection, but just as a sort of review, what sort of interactions at the anode would give you the highest energy photons? For example, if you set your kVp at 120 kVp for a chest, what kind of interactions would be giving you those 120 keV photons? Bremsstrahlung?
Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Is it characteristic?
No,
Yeah.
it's Bremс, but you only get 70 kV, up to 70 kV,
Okay.
or KeV from characteristic.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I want to photo
Photoelectric? At the anode?
Whatever he says is usually right.
Yeah, but you can get close, really close to the nucleus and create even higher energy ones.
Okay, good. So remember, the two interactions you do have at the anode are characteristic and Bremsstrahlung. Right? Characteristic is based off those electrons traveling down your shells, right? From the outer shells like O, P, N, down to your inner shells like K and L. Does that sound familiar? Okay, so you have a high energy photon coming from your filament. It knocks out that inner shell electron. An electron from one of your other shells falls down. When it falls down, it releases energy in the form of an X-ray photon. And that X-ray photon has a set value based on the binding energy of the two shells which are interacting. Right? So you kick it out of the K shell. The K shell has a certain binding energy. Right? 69.5 keV, right? You take an electron from one of those other shells, like N, for example, okay, binding energy of maybe 0.6. When it falls down to that 69.5, it releases that difference in energy. It is only going to release that difference in energy. You're not going to get anything else out of it. So with characteristic, you get set values of energy based on how your electron is moving between shells. The highest energy level we can get in characteristic using tungsten is around 69 to 70 keV. So those photons with 120 keV, they must come from the other interaction, which is Bremsstrahlung, right, or breaking interaction. Some of you are looking at me a little crazy. Do we need to review here?
I thought it was gonna happen.
Or is it because it's after lunch? I'm not quite sure which one it is right
Maybe a little both.
now. A little bit of both. Okay.
I think this class should go to the beginning of the day. All out of
You just ride the bike.
Okay. All right. We'll get back into swing of things. All right. So the average photon energy we get is going to be about 1/3 of the kVp, right? We have this nice curve, right? We have all these range of energies because of those Bremsstrahlung interactions, right? So Bremsstrahlung is going to give us that really high energy photon, right? In this case, if it's 100 kVp, it's going to give us that 100 keV photon, right? But it will also give us everything below it as well. The most common energy is going to be about 1/3 the kVp. So at 100, it'll be around 33. If it was 120 kVp, about what average energy should you expect?
What did you say, 120 kV?
So 120 kVp.
40.
40, very good, right? 1/3. 1/3 of your kVp. So now we have that primary beam, that primary radiation. So we have all of those ranges of energies and they're coming down to the patient. And when they reach the patient, they can undergo attenuation. So the basic definition of attenuation is that you're reducing the number of primary photons. So all those photons in the beam coming down, as you reduce their number, they are being attenuated. And so there's two ways to reduce the number of photons. Right? One is to just completely absorb them. Right? They come in, you absorb them, they do not go through the patient, so you've reduced the number. The second thing you can do, or the second thing that can happen, is scatter. So photon comes down, hits the patient, so it doesn't disappear, but it now goes in a different direction. And if that photon does not reach your image receptor, right, then in that case, it's not doing anything. It's like it should have reached the image receptor, but it didn't. So now you've reduced the number of photons and you have attenuation. Right? So absorption and scatter are your two methods of, or are the two ways a photon can be attenuated. So in contrast to attenuation, we have direct transmission. So if attenuation is the photons which were either absorbed, blocked, or redirected, what is direct transmission? Right, it is the photons which pass through. Okay, so when you have your IR and photons are hitting the IR, if the photons just went straight through without interacting with anything, that was direct transmission. Okay. Now we also have indirect transmission. So if direct transmission is the photon passing straight through and hitting the IR, what is indirect transmission? Scattered photons. Good, so you've got a photon, it comes through the body, but it hits something, it gets redirected, but it still reaches the IR. right? But it didn't go directly from your anode to the IR, right? It interacted, it ran into some stuff in between. Indirect transmission. So, of these two, which of them, are both of them, useful for diagnostic images? So, direct is useful for diagnostic images?
Yes.
Okay, so how would direct show up on an X-ray?
Dark.
Dark, right? So photon passes straight through, doesn't interact with anything, hits the IR, it darkens your IR. Right? So easy example, lungs, right? Not much to interact with in the lungs, lots of air, so photon just passes straight through, darkens your IR. Okay, so in that case, does the indirect transmission help create a diagnostic image?
No.
It doesn't? Okay, what does it do then?
It's fog.
It makes fog. Okay, what is fog?
The noise.
Okay, noise. What is noise?
I guess the
It's
image
usually
is
positive
red.
in spots it's not supposed to be.
Okay, let's see. Amy, what is your answer first?
I just think about it like it gives a blurry view to it, like not.
Makes the image look blurry?
Yeah.
All right, and then, John, what is
Like
yours?
you said, what is fog? It's
Mhm.
just the energy deposited where it's not supposed to be.
Energy deposited where it's not supposed to be. Great, so both of those are good answers. Right, so, actually, I thought I had fog in one of the slides. So, right, with fog, with your indirect transmission, photon comes in, it bounces off, it ends up somewhere it's not supposed to be. Right, so now it's exposing the cassette, but that information is not useful because it doesn't accurately reflect what is going on in the body. Right? So, what ends up happening is those photons bounce all over the cassette, and they do end up blurring the image. Right? So they make the image look less sharp, they make the image look less, they reduce the contrast of your image, and so you have radiographic fog. Okay? So,
It's depositing just little bits of energy all over the place, basically.
correct.
Okay.
And yes, noise is another term for fog. You can also use noise. So the image receptor is the one that collects information from both direct and indirect transmission. Ideally, it is only direct transmission hitting your image receptor. So we do need ways of reducing indirect transmission as much as possible. Okay. And just as kind of a brief review again, there are three types of image receptors. You've got your phosphor plates, DR receptors, and actual X-ray film. So just like the beam, we can talk about photons in the same way. So we have primary radiation, that primary beam. The photons are your primary photons. Okay. Photons that leave the body and reach the IR are exit photons, right? Because they got through the body and they hit the IR, they exited the patient. That doesn't say anything about whether or not it's direct or indirect. It just says that the photons came out of the patient and hit the IR. Okay, so these are exit photons or these are image formation photons. Any photons that did not reach the IR, so they were either absorbed or they were redirected somewhere other than the IR, are your attenuated photons. Right, so photon comes down, gets absorbed by the atom, okay, it doesn't go through, so it's attenuated, it doesn't exit the body. Photon comes out, it's absorbed, exits the body, but ends up in the wall, not the IR. It is attenuated. It never reached the IR, so it couldn't form the image. Now, not all photons that are redirected, right, are going to go off in a crazy angle. Some of them are going to just have a slight change in angle, so they come through the body, they interact, slight change in direction, they still reach the IR, right? So it is still an exit photon. It is still an image formation photon, but this is indirect because it does create that fog. Okay? So small angle scatter is basically the term we use for those exit photons that have a slightly different angle than that original photon. Right? That original photon was coming straight down. Small angle scatter would have it come at a slight angle afterwards. If it's coming in a slight angle, then maybe it scatters so that it goes straight down, right? But it's at a different angle than that original photon. And this is directly related to the amount of tissue irradiated. So, the more tissue you expose to X-rays, guess what happens? The more small angle scatter you have. And the more small angle scatter you have, the more radiographic fog you have. So, how do you reduce radiographic fog? You collimate, right? Mr. Donohue's favorite word, collimate. Actually, yeah, that's right. You have worked with Mr. Donohue. Yes, so. Mr. Donohue really loves his collimation, and for good reason, because collimation not only reduces patient exposure, but it also helps to reduce scatter. All right, and so now we get to our 5 photon interactions. So we have coherent scattering, we have photoelectric absorption, we have Compton scattering, we have pair production, and we have photodisintegration. Of these 5, I have 2 of them highlighted. If you had to guess why, what is the reason? Okay, these are the ones we're dealing with in diagnostic X-ray. So, photoelectric absorption, Compton scattering, that's what you will see inside your patients. Coherent scattering happens at energy levels that are a bit too low. Pair production, photodisintegration, those happen at energies that are too high for diagnostic X-ray. Okay. Now, if you do end up going to radiation therapy or nuclear medicine, then yes, you may end up encountering this. Okay, but for plain diagnostic X-ray, you're not going to see them. Okay, so let us start with coherent scattering. Well, coherent scattering has a bunch of different names. It can also be called classical scattering, or classical coherent scattering, or elastic scattering, or unmodified scattering, or Thomson scattering. Okay, so these are all ways to refer to the same concept of coherent scattering. With coherent scattering, there is no loss of energy. Okay, so we're not having a photon be absorbed, right? Because we're going to have an incoming photon, we have an outgoing photon, and the photons are the same energy. So we're only changing the direction of the photon. Right? This occurs at energies lower than 10 keV. Okay, so we're dealing with energies lower than 10 kilo electron volts. Okay? And so the reason why we don't really see this much in diagnostic X-ray is because that inherent filtration will tend to filter out these low energy X-rays, right? So that glass envelope on our X-ray tube, that that aluminum filter, even the mirror of your collimator, those will tend to help filter out those low energy X-rays in your primary beam, and so you're really not going to see coherent scattering too much. So, with coherent scattering, we've got energy from the photon being absorbed by an electron. Let's see. If I was to think, all right, well, actually, let's keep going first. So, we've got our electron here. Photon comes in, hits the electron. Photon is completely absorbed. Photon disappears. Okay. So, the electron does not leave the atom, right? It received energy from the photon, but the photon was too weak to knock the electron out of the atom, right? It did not ionize the atom. All it did was give its energy to this electron, which excites the electron. Okay, makes the electron a bit higher energy. Okay, so it's excited, it vibrates, it relaxes, and it releases a new photon. Right? So energy comes in, energy input, high energy. It wants to go back to low energy. To do so, it releases more energy. And of course, energy does take the form of a photon. And so this photon has the same energy as that initial photon, right? If we have a 5 keV photon, okay, gives this electron an extra 5 keV of energy. The electron gets rid of 5 keV energy. It does so by creating another 5 keV photon, right? So there's no energy lost here, right? The only thing that's going to change is that the direction of this new photon might be slightly different. I thought this was supposed to be an animated GIF, but it doesn't seem to be moving, so that's a bit unfortunate. Okay. I think what's supposed to be happening here is you see this, it's supposed to come here, hit this electron, disappear, and then the electron gets excited and then it shoots this somewhere else. Okay, so just sort of visualize it in your mind. It's supposed to look really pretty. Okay. So with coherent scattering, like I said, you will usually end up with a change in your photon's direction. Okay, so usually within plus or minus 20 degrees of that initial photon's direction. So coming in straight across, your new photon may be 20 degrees this way, 20 degrees that way. Can you have different angles? Yes. Can you have it go backwards? Yes. But it's just not as common. Most commonly, it's going to be somewhere within that 20-degree range. Okay. So this can lead to small amounts of radiographic fog, but for the most part, like we said earlier, you're not going to see this much because we've gotten rid of most of those low energy photons. Okay. Fun fact, coherent scattering is also responsible for the color of the sky. So if your kid ever asks you why the sky is blue, you tell them coherent scattering.
Will that be on the test? You can put that on the test.
Maybe. Okay.
So is there technically like a small amount of energy that's lost or absorbed with each one?
I mean, so my gut instinct is to say there most likely is a little bit of energy lost, because if not, then you could theoretically have this photon just keep bouncing forever.
Yeah.
Right? So my gut instinct is to say yes, some energy is lost, but based on the books that I've looked at, so not only this one, but your RadTech book as well, it didn't mention anything about that. So I can't tell you with certainty.
Right.
So as far as coherent scattering goes, the kind of analogy I have in my mind, right, is that you've got somebody just standing right here, right, just minding their own business. You walk up behind them, boom, right? You apply energy to the patient, to the person, right? Bam! they're excited. And then what did they do? They scream, they release that energy, but in a different direction. Right? So that's coherent scattering in my mind. Okay, so right, just imagine like Jessie standing there minding her own business, just walking by her, yell, imagine her screaming somewhere else, and that's coherent scattering. Right. Okay, next up is photoelectric absorption. So this one, it is part of diagnostic, what we see in the diagnostic range. So this will occur between a 23 to 150 kVp range. Okay, and this deals with interactions between the photon and an inner shell electron. Okay. Does this sound familiar?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'm not just asking about like, does it sound like something you've learned before, but does it sound like something we discussed earlier today?
Wait.
K-shells, inner shell electrons.
Characteristic interaction.
It sounds a lot like characteristic interactions, right? The thing that happens at the anode of the tube. What's the difference between characteristic interactions and photoelectric absorption?
Electrons interacting with electrons versus photons interacting with electrons.
Very good. So earlier we talked about characteristic interaction at the anode, right? High energy electron from the filament comes over, kicks out an inner shell electron from tungsten, and then those electrons jump down and release X-rays. Photoelectric absorption, very, very similar principle. The main difference is that rather than that high energy electron, you now have a high energy photon that comes in, kicks out that inner shell electron, and a new electron jumps down into its place. Okay? So characteristic interactions, photoelectric absorption, you can kind of link these in your mind, right? Because they all work on the same general principle. So we are going to be dealing with the inner shell, K or L shell. Okay, energy from the photon is going to be absorbed by the electron. And this time, because unlike coherent scattering, this time this energy is higher than the binding energy of the electron. So the energy holding the electron to the atom is the binding energy. Energy from the photon is greater than the binding energy. That is enough to kick this electron out of the atom. I thought I had the animation on this one, but I guess it didn't paste. All right. Sorry. My PowerPoint's kind of janky today, but hopefully it'll be fixed by next week. So, for photoelectric absorption, this ejected electron, right? So this electron inside that K shell or the L shell, the one that we knocked out of the atom, this is called a photoelectron. So because this electron is moving, it does have kinetic energy. It is able to interact with other atoms. So the energy of this electron is based on the difference between the energy of the incoming photon and the binding energy. Right? So there's a certain amount of energy holding the electron in place. We use that same amount of energy to knock it out of place. Whatever is left over is the electron's kinetic energy. And so that electron can travel, run into a different atom, and interact with that atom. Right? So if that electron has high enough energy, it can ionize that atom. If it has low energy, then instead it can just excite the atom it interacts with. And so when this happens, this does end up increasing our patient dose without contributing to the radiographic image. Okay? So it does increase patient dose, but it does nothing for our image. Okay. Now, not only is that ejected electron, not only is that photoelectron going off and causing issues with other atoms, we still have that open spot in that inner shell to deal with. So now we have an atom, and either the K shell or the L shell is missing an electron. And it really wants an electron. So where does it find an electron?
The one on the board.
From one of those outside shells, right? So, okay. Right, so we've got our atom here. Right. We have our electrons. We have our electrons. Right. We have our electrons. So remember, this is right K, L, M, N, O, P, right? So on and so forth. Okay, photon comes in. It kicks out this electron. This electron goes off as a photoelectron. Right? This photoelectron can then run into another atom over here and interact with its own electrons. Now we have an empty space right here. Oh, right, sorry, I should have do the thing. Okay, let's see. Self view, and then whiteboard, and then full screen. Ah, okay. And lights. All right. All right. All right. So. Yes? Is it weird just seeing me in 4 places at one time?
Yes.
All right, so. Are you okay with half the whiteboard being? Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. I don't know. It feels kind of like the anode Hill effect to me, but. All right, so we have our atom, right? We've lost an electron. This electron went off to interact with a different atom. So we need to fill this gap. So the atom is going to grab one of the electrons from one of the outer shells and bring it inside here. The outer shells are more unstable. When I talked about this with the juniors, I like to use the example of a pile of books, right? If you have a whole stack of books, right? The book on the bottom is your K shell. The book on top is whatever the most outside shell you have is. So if I was to take the second book from the bottom, right? So if I pull out my K shell book and have the second book from the bottom and it falls, does it fall very far? No. Does it have a lot of energy when it falls? Not really, right? Okay, but if one of the outside shell books was to suddenly fall down, right? One of the books near the top of the pile, if it fell down, would it have more energy? Right? So, as electrons fall from the outer shells to the inner shells, right? They are releasing energy. They're going from an unstable state to a stable state. They're going from wobbling up top here to being steady on the ground, right? When they do that, they are releasing energy. So in this case, when we have one of our electrons out here jumping into this opening, right, it is falling down. It is going to release energy. And once again, what does energy take the form of? A photon. So in this case, this shoots out a photon. Okay. Any guesses as to what this photon is called? So what is your guess the size?
X-ray?
X-ray. Okay, what did you say? Characteristic. I've heard the word characteristic somewhere before, haven't I? Where was it? In the tube, right? We talked about characteristic interactions. We said that this was very similar to characteristic interactions. In fact, it's so similar, the photon is called a characteristic photon or a characteristic X-ray. So both of you were correct. Okay, so this is called a characteristic photon or a characteristic X-ray. And the whole reason is because, just like in the tube, when you had a set energy level of your photon being created, this also has a set energy level based on the binding energies of these two shells. So electron jumps down here, it's always going to release that same amount of energy. The photon is always going to have the same amount of energy. Okay. Now, that's not to say it's always going to pull from the shell immediately next to it. It is possible to pull from one of these outer shells as well. If it does that, does it release more or less energy? What do you think? If it falls down from a farther shell, from a farther distance, does it release more or less energy? More, right? Just like the example of the falling book, the farther away it is, the farther it falls, the more energy it releases. Okay, so as your electrons fill, depending on which electron ends up filling, you can release different amounts of energy. But as long as they're coming from that specific shell, it's always going to be the same value for that fall. Does that make sense? So if it goes from L to K, it's always going to be the same value. If it goes from M to K, it's a different value, but it's always going to be that same M to K value. Right? So the L to K value is always the same, the M to K value is always the same, the M to L value is always the same. Right? So you're only going to get specific energy photons out of characteristic. That's why it's called characteristic. Now there is a final wrinkle to this. Oh, actually, before I get to that, let me just talk about one more thing. All right, so let's say that we kick out this electron, right? And now this photon moves in. If that happens, now I have an opening in my L shell, right? And what does that mean? It means I need something to fill this as well. So I'm going to pull from from another outside shell. So anytime you have a gap, you're going to try and fill from one of those outside shells. If that leaves a gap, it's going to fill from the next outside shell. And it's just going to keep doing that until you run out of outside shells. Okay, so if there's no more shells past this, then we just have a gap right here in M, and eventually a floating electron is going to get picked up and stuck inside that gap. Okay, so right, by doing that, you might end up, just like removing one photon or one electron, you could end up releasing 2 or more photons, just because you'll have multiple electrons filling multiple gaps. So this should all be very, very similar to what you talked about with characteristic interactions. Does this look kind of familiar, kind of similar? Kind of ringing some bells? All right. So, as I said earlier, there is one more wrinkle to talk about. There is one more really weird thing about this. And that is called the Auger effect. Auger pronounced A-U-G-E-R. It's French. And so for Auger, what happens is that, okay, so let me just erase this part down here. Okay. All right, so once again, I've got my electron here, got my electron here. All right, so photon came in, electron goes out. All right, so photon comes in, electron goes out. Next electron wants to take its place, electron jumps down. I now have a new opening right here. Okay. And then I release an X-ray photon, correct? Or I release a characteristic photon. Not this time. So this drop here from the outside shell to the inner shell is supposed to release energy. That energy is supposed to take the form of a photon. But in this case, this released energy is going to be commandeered by the atom. The atom is going to take this released energy and it's going to transfer this released energy to another electron. And when it transmits this energy to the new electron, depending on that electron's binding energy, it can kick this electron out as well. So instead of using this energy to create a photon, it uses this energy to kick out an electron. And so this electron is called our Auger electron. Right? So this electron here was our photoelectric electron. Okay. Here, I'll make this a squiggly line so you know it's energy. Okay. So, does that make sense? You didn't quite get that one. Okay, sure. Let's see. Let me think how we can do this. Okay, let me get some volunteers, please. Okay, how many people am I going to need? I'm going to need 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to need at least 5 people up here, please. I'm going to need 5 people, please. If you're not going to volunteer, then I'm going to end up having to volunteer people. So, all right, let's see. Jessley, Jolie, Aurora, Son, Esaias, come on up. All right. Let me make some name tags for you all.
Can I pick whatever is sitting down?
No. All right, I'm gonna need 1,
Low energy. I'm the nucleus. Are you a low energy?
2, 3. All right, so I think this should be enough. Let's see if this works. All right, no, just hold this, please. All right, there you go. All right, electron. Right, there you go. That's fun. All right, and then wait, does okay, and then our 2 photons here. All right, so let me get. All right, so the size come on over here. We're gonna come right over here. All right, and then okay, I'm gonna. So.
I'm showing.
She's fired.
All right.
You're probably regretting this right now.
Maybe. Okay, so let's have you 3 stand in the line, please. Stand in a line.
Stand, stop being lazy.
Stand in the line. All right, so let's say that we've got our K, L, M shells right here. Okay, you know what? Okay, there we go. Now we know our shells. All right, so we have our primary photon here. Our primary photon is going to come into this atom, right? So come on in, primary photon. All right, and you're like, all right, I'm going to crash into one of these electrons. So, all right, so it's like, all right, I'm going to come into, all right, hold on, K shell, go to the K shell, yep, go to Jody, okay. So, size comes here, right? Knocks our electron out of place, right? Okay, and then you disappear, so go ahead and sit down. All right, so our photon is gone, right? All of the energy has been transferred to our electron over here from the K shell. This electron has left the atom. What is the name of this electron? Photoelectric. Very good. All right. When this happens, we have an empty spot here now. Okay. These electrons want to fill the empty spot.
Not really.
So, L shell wants to jump down into the K shell. M shell jumps down into the L shell. When they move, what happens? It is supposed to release energy. So, son, come on over. Okay, so when they move, it was supposed to release a characteristic photon, right? Somewhere off into
Space.
the body. However, when we have the Auger effect, what happens instead is, right, come back over here, son. The energy from this photon, instead of leaving, is going to come over here and crash into the neighboring electron. So instead, so when Jesse walked over, you're going to come over to where Aurora is. Which one? Right here.
I'm Aurora.
And you're going to knock her. You're going to knock her out of place. Hi, Aurora. Aurora. Yep. Go ahead. All right. So the act of this L electron moving into the K shell released energy. Instead of going off into the body, that energy stayed in the atom and went over to a different electron. And the energy was high enough to kick this electron out of the atom as well. So what do we call this electron? This is our Auger electron, or Auger electron. Right? If you don't care how the French pronounce it. This is
Right,
Texas.
exactly.
That's true.
Exactly.
So instead of releasing this as characteristic radiation, okay, sun, our energy released during the L to K transfer kicks out this Auger electron. It's fully absorbed. Go ahead and sit down. All right. And this is what we're left with. We have no radiation leaving from this entire interaction, did we? Right?
No.
This photon came in, absorbed. This photon didn't leave the body. The energy from it just kicked out an electron and it disappeared. So there was no X-rays, there were no characteristic photons released throughout this entire process. All we're left with is some openings for electrons to fill.
So,
Come on, stand up, electron. Yes, John.
so would you then have, so now you got two vacancies.
Mhm.
So could you then thus have characteristic radiation form like further on down the road as
Yes.
more? Okay.
Yeah, so it is possible that now that we have two openings, some other electrons will jump into these openings, and that itself can release some radiation.
Can you also have more Auger effects as well too?
You
in theory?
could.
Okay.
Yes, you could. And so the thing is, with Auger effects, they actually reduce the amount of characteristic interactions, the amount of characteristic radiation that is released. And they reduce the amount of characteristic radiation that is released because they keep that energy within the atom and just use it to kick out electrons instead.
So what form does that energy take then?
So that's just an electron.
Well,
So
yeah,
the
but,
electrons
but,
are floating in the body?
Yes.
The
energy.
sun
Mhm.
sun photon
Yes.
ejected
Mhm.
when it ejected aurora,
Yes.
that energy
Mhm.
which would normally become a characteristic photon, but instead with the Auger effect, what
Mhm.
form does that energy take?
So that's a good question.
Is it just some
So I would probably need to look into it further, but if I had to guess, it would be that you have, like, you probably end up having the atom vibrate or be excited, and then the energy just gets transferred to one of those electrons. That would be my guess, but I would have to look into that for you.
okay?
Actually, you know what? I completely
Maybe just kind of like
forgot. I could have.
traveling.
Could have. I did.
I'm just curious, is there no like contribution, like I guess like to like diagnostic imaging, I guess? It's just something that happens?
Doesn't feel like it.
I forgot. I could have just done that instead.
Shirley with the K-shell, so she was the initial one here.
Like, see that electron, just see
It
that.
doesn't
Ah,
matter.
okay, there we
That
go.
will,
Yeah.
that particular.
That radiation, okay?
All right.
No, that's just, the only radiation that occurs is
So-
still the vacancy.
So are we kind of okay with this concept, or do we want to do it one more time?
No,
Are we
get the
okay?
concept, but like,
Again.
what he was asking about that.
Mhm.
So what is the point of that happening in diagnostic imaging? It's just like something that happens, is that all
Right.
you get out of it?
So this is something that will just randomly happen. It's not something that you can force to happen. It just randomly happens in the patient's body, and so it actually reduces the amount of radiation in the patient's body. So there's going to be less radiation than you would normally expect from your photoelectric effect, just because some of those characteristic photons are not being produced. Right, so you would expect, okay, I've got this many X-rays, this many are going to create photoelectric effects, which means I'm going to have this many characteristic X-rays. However, in reality, if you look at your characteristic X-rays, you have slightly fewer. And that's because some of those X-rays are being used for the Auger effect instead. So they're not being released into the patient. All right, round of applause for our volunteers. Thank you, thank you. You can keep it as a souvenir if you'd like, otherwise I'll just toss these.
Because that K-shell is a very strong binding, so it's going to absorb all of
Okay. So, all right, so just really quickly, okay, we're almost done for today, so just really quickly, as far as this Auger effect goes, this is considered to be a radiationless effect, okay? So it's not producing ionizing X-rays, it's not producing scatter because that energy is being absorbed and shooting out electrons instead. Okay? And so that brings us to this concept of fluorescent yield. The idea of fluorescent yield is that you expect a certain number of X-rays to be produced per inner shell vacancy. Okay? So the Auger effect reduces the fluorescent yield of the photoelectric effect, right? You kick out an electron, you have that inner shell vacancy, but now you have fewer X-rays produced because some of that energy is being used to kick out electrons instead of creating X-rays. All right. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. Now the book does talk, so I do want to just highlight one more thing. So the book does talk about the probability of photon interaction with matter. If you go to the very back of the book in Appendix D, you can kind of see how they calculate that, but it's not something that I'm going to go over. I don't think it's something too important, and it's a lot of math as well, so yeah. Okay, right. But just keep in mind that we are able to calculate the probability of photons either interacting or passing straight through matter, depending on their energy levels. All right. Great. So, any questions for today before I let you go? You text me? Okay. What is that? I mean, you text me all sorts of things, Justin. You're kind of like Amna in that regard. Okay, so I'll see all of you next week. Right? Remember, Monday group, I'll see you at LBJ in the afternoon. Everyone else, I will see you on Tuesday for radiation protection. Okay, how about, yes. Oh, actually, yes, that's a great question. Yes, I'm gonna say, I'll say yes. Just go ahead and clock out at your site before you arrive here. What is that, Ellie?
Remember the other day I was asking if there's a specific number of hours that we need for our clinic? Do you have any idea?
So, I talked with Mr. Donahue about it. We remember seeing something, but we're looking through the literature to figure out exactly